Well, I think most of us have seen the Man from Snow River movies at the pictures, where Tom Burlinson played the lead role as the Man from Snow River under the name of Jim Craig. But there was a real Man from Snow River, and his name's Jack Riley, and he lived in the country town of Corryong, and that was his home. But who is Jack Riley, and what is he about? Well, Marita from the Historical Museum in Corryong, she's going to tell us all about him.
Well, the Man from Snow River probably doesn't exist, but a man that the Man from Snow River was actually heavily based on, he did exist. And he lived in the Corryong area, up in Tomgrogan, which is just in the Victorian side of Kosciuszko. There's a lot of evidence that shows that Banjo Paterson actually based that poem around Jack Riley. Apart from the fact that he met Jack Riley in 1890, only a few months before the poem was published. One of the stories that Jack Riley used to tell around the campfire long before Banjo Paterson was that very story that he wrote about getting in wild horses. A wild horse in particular, a Brumby stallion that had gone loose.
Jack lived in a high country hut up in the hills in a cattle station named Tomgrogan, where he lived in isolation, and he only came into Corryong a few times a year for supplies.
He used to have a hut on the Snowy River, so he was the man from Snowy River. He wasn't a stripling lad at all when Banjo met him. He was well into his 50s at that stage, 60s, 70s probably, getting close to 70s. But, you know, let's face it, who wants to read about a guy in his 60s doing magnificent things on a horse? It's far more romantic and poetic if it's a nice young guy with muscles. And to be fair, he's probably much younger when he'd done that ride anyway. We also have evidence of him taking groups of tourists up into to Kosciuszko. He was the guide that would take them up a very rough and difficult to find trail. And in a 1905 diary entry, it actually describes their guide, names him as Riley, and says at one point, the path must have been traversable because our guide went down it on his horse. However, we all dismounted and walked ours down. It was so steep. So there's elements of the poem that can be certainly substantiated. And even in the 1914 obituary, when Jack Riley died, which was exactly 100 years this year in July, it mentions that fact that the poem was heavily based on Jack Riley's exploits in the mountains.
The word had passed around that the legendary Jack Riley was unwell, so 5 horsemen set out from Tomgrogan to bring him back to Corryong Hospital. But he passed away before reaching hospital in the mountains that he called home. And this is the buggy that carried his body on his final trip into Corryong.
And he was buried in the Corryong Cemetery up here. In the 1980s, Tom Mitchell, who was our local member for MLA, put a big headstone there and recognised him as the Man from Snowy River in that time. And it was Tom Mitchell's father, Walter, and his brother Peter, who had taken Banjo Paterson originally up to Kosciuszko and stayed the night with Jack Riley and heard the stories. So that's where that connection came in. The Mitchells were friendly with Banjo Paterson, and we've got letterheads to prove that they were in correspondence as well. So there is a lot of evidence around that.
Jack died in his 80s on the 16th of July 1914, and he was known as a legendary horseman and the lover of the solitude of life.
Out of all the contenders that has sort of come out of the woodwork in the last few years pretending that they had the Man from Snowy River, none of them were on the western side of Kosciuszko to start with. So, and none of them could prove that they met Jack Riley. Banjo Paterson also wrote another poem that was never published until after he died, but it was called Johnny Riley's Cow. And it was about federation, and it talked about how, with the different state duties, Johnny Riley's cow would step from New South Wales into Victoria on a daily basis, and therefore was supposed to pay duty each time he travelled interstate. Now, Banjo couldn't have written that without knowing exactly how narrow the Murray River was at that point, the boundary was at that point. So there's a lot of evidence, And the people that think that it's not, it is a work of fiction. He probably had an influence from a few others, but 90% of it is Jack Riley's story.
So Tom, with the Man from Snow River being such an iconic name within Australian history, what was it like playing that role within the Man from Snow River movie?
It was a great challenge. It was a great honour. Especially I realised when I came down to the high country of Victoria, because I knew the poem and, you know, we all learnt it when we were in primary school. But I didn't know a lot about the heritage of the mountain cattlemen and, you know, that whole culture, I guess. So, especially when I came down here, I became aware of quite the responsibility of playing this great hero of the Australian bush and of Australian bush folklore and of Australian literature. When I was cast in the movie, I had sat on a horse about half a dozen times in my life. And was certainly no rider, so that was a big part of the challenge, learning all the practical skills, not just horse riding, but cracking the stock whip and chopping wood and all of those things, and even, to a certain extent, the history of the region.
So where did you learn to ride and how long did it actually take to pick it up?
Well, the producers had allocated some time before shooting started, for me in particular, and Sigrid Thornton too, to come to terms with that side of it. So, and what they did was that they sent us on these Lovick trail safaris up into the high country for, you know, 8 days at a time or 5 days at a time. So we were on horseback all day, you know, and you can't help but get better. You can't help but learn. And the shoot was actually quite long, and so by the time we came to do Jim's ride and the really tough riding sequences, which were at the end of the shoot, I was good enough to be able to do as much as I did, which was a lot.
I think the way the movie's been cast and the way it's been filmed, I think it certainly portrays that man from Snowy River and the kind of person he was.
At the beginning, when they were talking about making a movie of the man from Snowy River, people's reaction was, well, how can you make a feature film out of that? It's a ride. So what Jeff Burrows and George Miller, the producer and director, did was they imagined a whole background to those events. And they thought, well, what about a boyhood to manhood type story following one of these young mountain cattlemen and through his romantic adventures and, you know, and as they say in the movie, earning the right to live in the high country, which is a very big theme in the movie. All of that was an imagined background to the events of the poem, which are depicted very faithfully in the movie too. And, you know, he sent the Flintstones flying and all of that. That's all there, yeah.
The story of that ride that the poem is sort of heavily based on, Jack Riley actually said himself at the end of it, I was blind with tears and, you know, and hits in the face with timber, he said, and he'd actually gone past the stockyards and not realised that the Brumby had got himself in the stockyards. So he says it was more good luck than good management, but yet he's the only one that stayed on his horse and went down that hill, and the rest said, no, you can't do it, and walked away. So met him down the bottom and there he was with the horse.
The museum is not just based around Jack Riley, it also has extensive exhibits covering all aspects of local history.
Nearly 95% of our collection is local, very local. We have had collections from a lot of the older houses around town, a lot of the older properties and older families have been very generous in donating items for the collection, and we've built on it from that over the 50 years. The volunteers have done an amazing job at collecting our local history.
Now have a look at this. This prefabricated cell was sent out from England all the way to Corryong in the early 1900s. And one of Ned Kelly's mates, Wild Wright, actually spent one night in this very cell. And he's got his name inscribed on the walls inside. Yeah,
well, our museum has actually been here for nearly 50 years in this building. We've got an amazing collection of highly significant, internationally significant items, nationally significant, really everyday items, covering every aspect of life in the Upper Murray from the very early 1830s onwards, when European men first came to this area. So it's definitely worth a visit. Open 7 days a week and shouldn't be missed if you're coming through this way at all. It's fantastic.
Jack Riley is the man from Snowy River, which inspired Banjo Paterson to write one of Australia's most famous poems about Jack's life as a legendary horseman. And also, did you know that this year's 100 years since Jack died on the 16th of July 1914, and also it's 150 years since the birth of Banjo Paterson on the 17th of February 1864. And I hope to see you out in the bush here someday.